Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Innovation Conversation. Today we are joined by Sven Jungmann, who's the CEO of Halitus. He's also a doctor, but we're not going to say he's a doctor. Sven, we're very much excited to have you here. Me and Harry were actually talking about your company. So tell us all about Halitus, what do you do? Please introduce yourself to our audience.
Thank you so much. It's great to have you, and I'm looking forward to this. I'm Sven, as you said, medical doctor originally. Left the bedside quite a while ago to go into innovation stuff. I also studied some things on the side, which I think set the precedence for that. So public health, public policy, entrepreneurship. Then worked, well, I sort of studied along this whole journey. It was not sequential, but anyway, worked in the hospital for a while, mostly in internal medicine, which included lung diseases, cancer care, and emergency medicine. It was nice, but I felt like there's too much sand in the gears everywhere, and we're treating things that we shouldn't be treating because they could have been preventable, and we're doing it in the most ineffective way possible quite often. So I got frustrated, honestly, and also felt it's not so creative
Mm-hmm.
quite often, and then ended up in digital health innovation for quite a few years, mostly in what's called like corporate venture building. So
Yeah.
established organizations trying to build new companies. At that time, I was convinced that this is the right thing to do simply because the entry barriers and the scaling, rate limiting steps to scaling are so massive in this highly regulated, complex market, where the payers are different people than the beneficiaries and all of this market inefficiencies, that it makes sense to team up with the big players. And I think that was a smart logic, but in practice it often fails because the price you pay is a lot of politics and slow decision making processes and all of this. So I left after many years, and then ended up co-founding my current company, which is called Halitus. And here, the basic idea is that there is a lot of data in the air, and specifically also in the breath, that we're currently largely ignoring. Right? If you look at what dogs can smell and how they run around with their noses exploring the world, there's a whole invisible world that is rich of information, of data, and it's abundantly clear in science that with each breath, we exhale more than 1,000 unique different molecules that have something to say about what's going on in your body. And many of them have been linked to certain diseases. There are big lab studies that give a lot of insights on, this is elevated or depressed in certain cancers, in autoimmune diseases, in infectious diseases, and so on, not just related to the lung, but even in your body. And nobody really, until well now, or still not, has found a meaningful way to take sort of this ability to analyze these things out of the lab into everyday care. And it's a bit more complicated than other things for a variety of reasons. But we're in the race to solve this, hopefully. And that's largely what we do. So teaching machines to smell in order to find diseases faster and figure out if treatments are not working well and so on.
It's quite interesting because you mentioned, the way that Western medicine works. But if you actually go to a Chinese, if you do traditional Chinese medicine,
Mm.
they actually smell your breath, which
Yeah,
is a bit awkward position. Like,
yeah.
I don't know, Harry, if you ever had this experience, but there's a Chinese doctor in Chinatown, and you go there, and he kind of measures your pulse, but then he also asks to smell your breath, which is quite bizarre. But then it does make sense, obviously, when you're talking
Mm.
about how much more information you can actually gather from
Mm.
your breath. How are you finding this, like, to actually build something like that? Because it must be hard to analyze just from a single, from our, I guess, your, how should I call this? From our breath, how easy is it to actually analyze all the molecules that come out?
Yeah,
Because like,
yeah, yeah.
there's a lot of mixtures, right?
So you're making two brilliant points. I think first of all, it's not just Western or Chinese medicine. Actually, Galen back in the days, like one of the earlier doctors, also used to do that. They even used to taste things. So diabetes mellitus
Yes.
means actually it's the sort of the sweet urine and so on.
That
And
must be an awkward position to be in, to actually taste everyone's urine to see if it was sweet or not.
there's a typical joke in for like the very first year graduate medical students, probably even like the first week, where a lecturer goes around and then he has this like urine sample thing with,
Yeah.
of course it's apple juice, right? But he basically runs around and then he says, well, you need two things as a doctor fundamentally to be successful. Number one is You need to have a very good sense of observation, like observation skills. And secondly, you need to have a low or high threshold for things that are disgusting, right? And be highly tolerant to disgusting stuff. And then says, I'll show you what I mean. And he basically dips his finger into that urine sample thing, and then starts to lick the finger, and he sort of gives it around to people. And then he said, "Okay, great, well done. So you've proven that you're able to overcome your sort of your sense of disgust or whatever. But the observation skill was lacking because you should have seen that I dipped this finger in, but I was licking this one, right? And so kind of one of the inaugural rituals for medical students. Anyway, so this has all been part of medicine, and I think what happened is that we started to technologize a lot of these things, right? The stethoscope and so on. And the one thing that we haven't really technologized until today is the sense of smell. And that kind of, for me, means this is part of the reason why we ended up not doing it so much anymore, because simply it's really hard to reproduce it, to objectify it. When people talk about smell and want to describe things, it's hugely metaphorical, right? How we talk about, I don't know, it's a bit of an earthy taste, it's a bit like a pear. If you listen to wine connoisseurs and all of this, it's always by analogy and metaphor, right? So we don't like that in medicine. We like to be kind of increasingly precise. We have metaphors, but it's not kind of losing it. Nevertheless, you will find articles on people smelling Parkinson's disease and this being researched more and more. And so I think, or you see doctors, smelling paper that patients bring to see if it's really true that they stopped smoking, and things like that, and looking for subtle signs. To your point on how difficult it is, it's very difficult for a lot of reasons. So first of all, the things we are trying to find, these are particles per billion. So it's really trying to find the needle in the haystack, for one. The second thing is you don't have this one biomarker that is associated with like one disease, right? So typically you have to what's called multiplex to look at several ones to get closer to the truth, and then look at how they relate to each other and so on. And a lot of it is frankly really not yet understood. There are some markers that in the cancer they can be elevated because they are an end product of that cancer's metabolism. It could also be that the same cancer or another cancer uses this molecule for the metabolism, so then it might be depressed. And then there are some molecules, they are in the blood, and then they get they land in the lung where you expire them. But some of these molecules are very blood soluble, so they don't really like to leave the blood so fast as others. And then if you lie down, if you're in supine, then there's more blood in your lung area, especially in the upper part. So there is a bigger surface to exchange that molecule, which means the molecules that are super blood bound, they suddenly come up in higher concentrations simply because the surface of exchange is higher. And then you might think, if you don't know that, oh, well, there's an increase all of a sudden, but there's not. It's just that more came out.
Where's your baseline? How do you get it? Because this is a brand new concept. So where's the baseline? How do you determine what's what?
Excellent question. So a couple of tricks. One is you have to standardize the exam, right? People should be sitting, or if not, then you have to write it down. Don't eat and drink before, a lot of these things. There are different protocols. It's not yet standardized. This is all a very nascent kind of field. So I think a lot of work needs to be done there. People are doing that work, but we're not quite there yet. The other part is we believe knowing how to put these things into relation to one another is really important. And sort of, if you look at CO2, that's a super key thing because it has a very typical curve, and it's a bit different diseases also. But just from that, you can know basically where am I in this exhalation process. And we are combining lasers together with like a very old-fashioned classical lung function test. But that tells us, okay, now somebody's breathing through it. Now not. This is the amount of air that went through it. So we can also compare that with the environmental air to rule out contaminations and so on. And that's kind of something you have to do. And the super exciting thing is looking at a person's changes over time. So rather than having an absolute cutoff like you have with blood samples, just look at the relative developments and benchmark a person against themselves in the past. Is something that can be very helpful in certain use cases.
And how quick is it to actually do all these tests and to get that measure? Because if you want to do comparisons, then I'm assuming you should
Yeah,
be pretty quick to get that analysis, right?
you're absolutely right. So it depends on the technology, right? The ones that I mentioned that are in the lab, they can take up to many days. So that's too slow, and that's the problem, frankly. But they are really good for research purposes because it's basically it's a technology called mass spectrometry, typically with gas chromatography together, like big devices. You put them in a lab, and then samples are being sent in. Then they get analyzed after you prepared the sample, which can take days. And that's great because it shows you everything that's in the breath, right? And there are other technologies. So we're going for like lasers, optical. There are others called electrochemical, which have their own problem, but people are starting to find solutions for it. And they can be really fast. So there we're talking minutes, right?
Interesting.
Or
So
less.
so the Halitus is developing technology to analyze your breath and the changes in molecules that
Yeah.
you know transpire from your expiration. Correct me if I'm wrong on all this terminology. And then based on that, based on that you create several baselines for what's healthy, what's not healthy, what are the markers for some of different types of cancers or well just halitosis really and stuff like that, so we can emulate what's what. And this is all done by lasers, which then measure the differences in the molecules. Is that correct or?
So our approach is, I don't want to make it too complicated. If you want me to, I can do it. But I mean, just at a high level, it's called tunable diode laser absorption spectroscopy.
Okay.
So you have a tube, it's highly reflective,
Hmm.
and then on one end there's a laser, and the laser shoots through it and gets reflected hundreds of times, ends up ending up in a photo detector like a sensor,
Hmm.
and at a very narrow, so by definition lasers are very narrow on their wavelength, and then hits the other side. If there's nothing in between, the laser looks pretty much the same with sort of a little bit of less power because of the reflection. So every time it reflects, it gets absorbed a little bit, right? Even if you have
Yeah.
like a highly reflective, so it's never 100%. Um, and then when our molecule of interest, so basically you have like a wall of laser. It's like if you're in a Mission Impossible movie or Ocean's 11, and they try to
Yeah.
break into that, super safe thing there with lasers and
Hmm.
so on. And we're basically building a laser wall that makes it really hard for the molecule to do that Mission Impossible move and get through it without being hit by the laser. And then the laser gets absorbed partially on a very specific part of the what's called the absorption spectrum. So people measured all sorts of molecules and how they absorb lasers differently. So there you have databases, and then we choose a very specific line. Kind of feels like you're scanning for a fingerprint, right? And
Yeah.
then it's this one part. It's very idiosyncratic for that specific molecule, and if that absorption happens in that specific part, we can be fairly certain that this was just this molecule. And the more it gets absorbed, the more you have of these molecules, so you can even estimate
So
concentrations.
is it the same way that we know what the components of a specific star are, for example? Because when we get that light reflected onto Earth, it kind of splits up the light, and then depending on the variance in color, you can determine which molecules, which elements are actually composed the planet is made of. So is it similar to that,
Yeah,
or?
I think there are some similarities in principle, partially. I don't want to lean myself too far out of that window because it's I'm not too much in the space
But
tech.
it's so. And I know Harry is like aching to ask you a question in terms of like funding and
Oh yeah,
grants and all that. So Harry, do you want to ask a question regarding this? Because it's quite interesting. I think what's interesting for me is are you like the company is very it's absolutely amazing what you're doing. Did you apply for any funds or any
yeah,
grants? And how do you get started? Because I imagine all this equipment can be very expensive.
exactly. So I just published an article around this, and I mean, you know, we're among ourselves. Eh? The thing is, it's super painful. I thought when I started, I can easily just fundraise a couple of million, get to like some key evidence inflection points, and then fundraise with a nice valuation jump for the next round. Probably in 2021 or 2020, something like this would have been possible. Frankly, I struggled massively. So most of the VCs, especially the European ones, there are not really VCs; they're more like bankers.
Mm-hmm.
And often, especially, I mean, I learned to not look at the web page copy, but just to look at where did they invest.
Yeah.
Because if you hear the copy, oh, we're back the brave, we want to shape the future, blah 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 blah. If you look at their investment portfolio, it's the fifth Tinder copycat and another home grocery delivery service, or I don't know. They want to do like climate change, and then all they do is carbon trading platforms and all of this, right? So that, I mean, you often have that, and I stop talking to people when I don't see evidence that they're really committed to putting money to where their webpage copy is.
Yeah.
Um, and and then often the question I get is, so when do you have first customers? And then my answer is, well,
Yeah.
probably 4 years, with all the regulatory approval, clinical trial, and all this. And oh, well, no, sorry, that's too slow for us. It doesn't work with our
Mm-hmm.
LP funding structure, and all of this. And also, it's too risky for us, and so on. And then they like a typical thing that they would say is, why don't you come back when you have first customers? And then I'm like, bro, because when I have first customers, I'm not talking to a pre-seed Series A investor.
Yeah. One
I'm
need the money.
actually busy talking to the M&A advisory firm and then to my real estate agent for my beach house holiday home. Like, what
Yeah.
the heck is wrong with you? And they don't understand it. But what they're trying to get at, and often these are people that come from like an e-commerce world where you don't have like these R&D cycles. They don't like R&D. They just like commercialization and hockey sticks. And so they think that there's a lot of surrogative data in the fact that you have customers, because if you don't know how to do diligence that,
Yeah.
let your customer do it. By definition, they are experts. Otherwise, they wouldn't buy a device like that.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't send it back, it means it kind of works, and you have the pricing sorted and la 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 la. Right, but that works in other worlds. It doesn't work in a deep tech R&D heavy
Yeah.
business case. And so that was a massive challenge. And so what I did is what I ended up calling the Tarzan mode, which is you jump
What's
from
Tarzan?
one convertible loan to
Mm-hmm.
the next, and sometimes it's like, okay, there's 3 weeks runway left.
Mm-hmm.
I hope something good happens, and then suddenly you get that phone call and somebody writes you a check, and you're like, okay, cool. So here is to another 3 months, and you just keep doing that, and then slowly sort of improving the development of the company, and also creating a league of very good investors who give you more credibility, who can give you help, and so on and so on and so on, which is really helpful. But one thing that I learned is it really helps to try and actually not spend that money right away, but to accumulate it, because then you become eligible for many of the grants,
Yeah.
which require you to have some sort of liquidity and to make some advanced payments and then get reimbursed afterwards. And if you don't have that because you just kept investing it right away in some of your hardware,
Mm-hmm.
then you can't leverage it with non-dilutive funding, right? So that's one thing. And stop me if I'm rambling on too much, but
No, no. I was wondering something because obviously I can see the advantages of the technology, but I'm curious on one thing. Would this technology potentially give you more insights and quicker insights into what's happening in the human body than the current analysis that you have, in the top end hospital? Or would it be cheaper than a top end hospital to actually detect all these things? Or could you, for example, prevent changes in like your precancerous cells that
yeah.
oftentimes are neglected? So is that something that you could detect potentially?
So a couple of things. And then also it depends a bit on the type of technology that you have to match to the problem you're trying to solve. But I don't want to make it too complicated, but maybe at a high level,
Yeah.
if you go to a doctor these days and you have certain symptoms, it's actually quite limited what they can do right in that direct interaction, right? So they can do a
I
physical
normally just type
exam.
in a computer, at least in the UK. That's all I do. Type in a computer, and then 10 minutes in,
Yeah.
and you're right.
And if you got somebody who really cares about these things, then they would do a physical exam. They would do an auscultation and so on. Then you can get to an EKG, and all of this that can also be done.
Yeah.
But then the next step often is probably an X-ray, of
Mm-hmm.
course, blood samples, a CT scan, and so on. And now, if you think about lung cancer, there's pretty solid evidence, and of course, people will challenge that. But if you can look at the U.S. Preventative Task Force studies and so on, or CDC, that say that probably somewhere around 17% of the deaths caused by lung cancer can be completely avoided
Yeah.
If you would screen them properly, if you screen people properly.
It's quite a high
So
figure.
I think it's quite a lot, right? Because that also, I mean, that's a hard cutoff. That also means that maybe other people will still die of it, but have a better journey, which is less painful and so on. And screening is really difficult because you have just finding something early doesn't help if you don't have the right infrastructure to do something with it.
Yeah.
So if all was perfect, probably you could even go further than that. Anyway, so in the US, they say if you are a high risk patient, which means you have a certain age and you smoke quite a lot, to simplify things a little bit, then you should be getting a CT screening. And out of these people, there are different studies, somewhere around 6 to 16% of the people who are really doing that, which for me is a screening failure, right? In Europe, we're not doing it in many countries because we're afraid of false positives. There are also false negatives. You radiate people with that CT scan, it's costly, and then there's a lot of follow-up that needs to be done and so on. So it's not a great solution. And our hypothesis is that what if you could go to your GP, or maybe you go to your lung doctor because you have a COPD because you've been smoking so much.
Yeah.
And then all you need to do is blow into a device, which if you have COPD, you will anyway be doing regularly because you need to have your lung function test. And we screen you for markers, and then we flash it up and we say, hey, look, it's actually quite likely that there's something that needs more checkup. Please go do a CT scan. And then if the CT scan is ambiguous, we have another source of data, which is our breath test, plus that ambiguous data set, which reduces the ambiguity towards this might really be something. And then we think we could have a screening uptake of like easily 50, 60, or maybe 70%, because people driven out of symptoms anyway will end up having to do lung function tests.
Potentially, just thinking about how to make this very commercial, you can actually reduce costs for insurance companies. Let's think about the US model now. You can actually reduce all the costs because instead of them automatically sending people who are smokers to do very costly exams and take a lot of hospitals and a lot of expenses, they could just say, you know what, just do a breath test. Let's see if you qualify, and then we'll continue doing the testing.
Exactly.
And the same thing, I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, could you also do the same thing for like colonoscopies and stuff like that? Because I think you can also detect it on breath. What's that bacteria that you can detect on your breath? Forgot.
Helicobacter pylori.
H. pylori, exactly, yeah. Because you can actually, there's two ways of detecting it. Either someone puts a tube in a place you don't want the tube to go, or they can do a breath test.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. I mean, I don't think we will be replacing everything that there is, but we can complement, and sometimes we can fill in gaps that are not there. And then, of course, there will be situations where we can replace. But I believe a lot of entrepreneurs in the diagnostic space, they feel pressure to sell you the next silver bullet, the one thing that's making a lot of other things obsolete. And I think in most cases, that's simply not what's going to happen. It's going to be creating more data. Like if you're in a dark room and there's somebody with a flashlight pointing one direction, there's another person in the room, flashing another way. And then by putting that image together in an intelligent way, that's when you end up getting the full image. And then you also have to be smart about what do you do in what sequence, right? So the CT scan, for example, is something I'd rather do a bit later when my pre-test likelihood is pretty high because I've done enough other exams, because it's radiating, so it can cause cancer, because it's expensive, and so on and so on.
But how are you finding, like, obviously, you told me it's hard to get to these investors. What about, like, public grants or universities?
Yeah.
Is it?
So I'm really annoyed, frankly, with I'm now talking about Germany plus Europe, with our funding scene, because they make it so complicated. And when you first look at it, it's like, oh, great, there's a million here, a million there, blah, 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 blah. But then you look at it and they say, well, but it's only for things where you really need that money. So you have to prove that without it, you can't make it. But then also it has to show like a positive business case in 2 years. And you're like, bro, I'm doing medtech. Like, again, this is going to be 4 years. You don't want to fund that or what? And then they say, well, now we can find a way, but then you need to hire a marketing person to make it credible that you're already like sort of going towards commercial. I'm like, why do I need a marketing person? So I start
You
hiring.
need to lie to get the grant or something like that.
Yeah, and so that's frustrating. And then they tell you, but you have to have a minimum amount of this and this money. In Germany, if you have convertible loans, that counts as debt, although you don't have to pay them back. So then you're a company at risk, and then some of the things you can't get. and then you have to pay in advance, and then you get it back like half a year later. So you don't have so much cash. It really helps. And then there's a big overhead. There are agencies that make big business out of helping companies to get the grants and then to manage the bureaucracy through it, and so
Okay.
on. So I feel like I get it. It's public money. You don't want it to go to waste. But frankly, you end up helping a smaller proportion of startups that might still need it, but not quite so much. And
But,
you're making me bend backwards and sideways in order to get like a couple hundred K.
but then it always goes to waste, because that's one of the I guess the things that most people don't realize is that a lot of startups fail. But
Yeah,
then as they fail, they also learn some lessons, and they might not apply them straight away, but then you keep on building on it. And it's the same thing. It's the basis of any scientific research, really.
yeah,
You keep on failing and seeing, okay, this doesn't work. Let's try something else. This doesn't work. Let's try something else. So
yeah,
it's part of life. That actually,
yeah,
you should fail. That's how you learn.
yeah, 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 yeah. And building on that, so the other part is they typically, especially the European ones, they always want you to build consortia. So I have a clear problem I want to solve. Oh, no, no, no. I have to find two other SMEs and then one academia and this. And then they can't all be in Northern Europe, but there has to be somebody from somewhere else. And then you marry up with people where you realize quite quickly, actually, this makes zero sense. Like it doesn't make sense from a business perspective. It doesn't make personally sense in all of this. And plus, I mean, there is pretty strong evidence that it makes sense to create clusters of excellence where people are really
Yeah.
close together. That's what Boston is. That's what Silicon Valley is. It's what the Silicon Fen around Cambridge is, and so on. And Europe, out of ideological reasons, which I like, I subscribe to that idea that we all collaborate. But now we're diluting things so much that this experience, also from learning from failure,
Hmm.
then gets diluted everywhere, and you don't create a critical center of excellence. And they could create one for healthcare in city A. They could create one for something else somewhere else. But I think aggregating these learnings would be helpful. And the current funding scene is
So
pushing against that, I think.
what about finding funding from abroad?
Yeah.
For example, from the UK or from the US?
Yeah.
How does that?
I've been doing that quite a lot. The Americans are so much better. Here there's always this, oh, the Americans, they're such risk takers. We don't have this risk taking. Well, yes, but also they're very intelligent risk takers, right? If I talk, as I said, if I talk to a German investor, typically the answer is, oh, do you have customers already? And then if no, it's a bad sign,
Yeah.
right? If you talk to an American, and I've had that a few times, you have a fund manager, whatever,
Hmm.
and then one or two PhDs in physics and in chemistry. And then there's Jack, who's been working with the FDA for 20 years. And they also give you some advice as you go through this pitch. And like, wow, how much do you charge for this, right? And then they ask you, for example, okay, cool. So you're a pre-seed diagnostics company. Would it be possible that you supply us with 20 raw data sets of different people blowing through it?
Hmm.
And then we would like to see what your data evolves into after each data processing step so that we have an idea of your data quality journey. And
Hmm.
I'm sitting there, I'm like, I've talked to hundreds, literally hundreds of European investors. I got this question 0 times.
Hmm.
If I think about it, this is probably the only relevant question at this stage, aside from, what's your team and all of this.
Yeah.
That's also what they ask. And you need somebody who's intelligent enough to understand that this is the relevant question. And then you need people who are educated enough to make sense of the answer that you're sending them.
Yeah.
But
Of
I haven't
course.
seen that in Europe. I really, frankly, I haven't seen it.
But it's a bit now by comparison, it's a bit like you walking into someone's kitchen and you find out they're a good chef or not because they have the right utensils, they have the right spices, and you think, you know what, they're probably doing something right, even though they haven't started. It's the same thing with
Yeah,
you. If you're gathering all the data and it's very relevant data, yes,
yeah,
we understand that's part of the process, but these are good indicators that you're starting off right. You're probably going to end up in a nice place, right? Instead of just expecting you to arrive with all the solutions saying, hey, I
yeah,
have a product and I have customers, I just need more money to expand. Well,
yeah.
how do you get there? It doesn't make any sense.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a chicken and egg problem over and over again. And then I talk to British investors, and they often don't like to invest in Europe because of the tax schemes and so on.
Yeah.
And then I talked to one who was pretty big, and he listened to this,
Mhm.
and then there was something that didn't make sense to him, and I was trying to get at it. And then throughout the conversation, I realized what he was actually asking. He wasn't quite so explicit. He was British about it,
Yeah.
but what he was actually asking was, if you're really so cool, why are you in Germany? That was fundamentally the thing that he didn't understand.
Well, you could have said that we have better sausages and the beer tastes nicer.
Well, I mean, my answer was like, look, BMW, Porsche, like BASF, BioNTech,
Hmm.
like we have a history of like big tech stuff, right?
Yeah, and the innovation as well.
Siemens
Germany's known
company,
for
yeah.
quality stuff. Yeah.
No, but I know I get him because these are all the big players, and BioNTech would not have made it without Pfizer
Yeah.
and a few other people. And BioNTech also started to look into going to the UK now because everything's moving too slow.
Interesting.
So,
It's something like we talk with a lot of people from all over the world, and it's always interesting to see how certain areas work in certain regions, and then the other way around. So no one, some people in the UK say, "Oh, we should go to Europe because they're more likely to fund this." And then it's funny seeing someone in Germany saying, "Actually, I should move to the UK or should move to the US
yeah,
because I'm much more likely to get funding there because people are more open and they actually
yeah.
understand the steps required for this." It's quite interesting going there.
I mean,
But
the grass is always greener on the other side, they say, right? And I'm sure that's true partially. However, I cannot fully announce all the details yet, but we are very intensively looking into headquartering in the US.
mhm.
And suddenly, so many things are so much easier. Suddenly I have a seven-figure funding soft committed on top, where here it's really struggling.
Yeah,
Um,
but it makes sense because when you look at the number of
yeah,
patents that are registered every year, the highest number is still in the US, right? And there's a reason why it keeps on being in the US because they have this openness to innovation, openness to creation, and also a willingness to accept risk as part of the journey, right? And to a certain extent, you also find that in the UK, people, yes, they understand there
mhm,
is risk. They're not particularly, happy about risk, but it's part of the process. Whereas in other countries, and I'm from Portugal, I find this a lot, is that people are like, oh, if it's not a done deal, then it's not going to happen. Well, but hold
exactly.
on. Until you get to that stage, you need to try a lot of things. It doesn't just, it's like learning how to walk. You don't just get up and start walking. You're going to fall a couple of times, right? It's part of the journey. But yeah, people just don't get that.
There's a beautiful saying which pops up all the time, all of a sudden in my life, but that's sometimes how it is, right? Which is the work you do works more on you than you work on it.
Hmm.
And I think proper investors understand that a lot. And like sometimes I have some investors, they like to start with small tickets after, of course, having done a proper due diligence, but primarily to figure out, to play the HR game, right? To figure out, okay, how is this entrepreneur evolving? How is he or she adjusting, learning, communicating, pivoting, etc. And that and that then defines how much money they want to put in for real afterwards.
I was thinking about a company that was on the news for quite really really bad reasons, but because they're a US-based company, I actually managed to go that far, which is Tyrannos, right? Is it? Am I pronouncing the one that was doing
Awareness,
Lancaster?
yeah,
So she got quite far, and then she managed to even like make it commercial at a certain extent, get a lot of contracts, with a lot of companies just on this idea that it could work, but in reality, it never did. But it just goes to show how willing are the companies in the US to believe in
yeah,
something that is still very
yeah,
just trying it out,
yeah,
but
yeah,
also for all the investors to back these new ideas. Whereas in Europe, people will never until they see the actual machine
yeah.
working, they're like, yeah, I'm not going to invest in this.
Yeah. I mean, Theranos is a very unfortunate case, which is a right
Yes.
out fraud. And if you look at the people who invested, they were probably, many of them were quite prominent. Donald Rumsfeld, I think, was part of it,
Hmm.
and didn't know anything about healthcare.
Yeah.
And the medical community started to raise concerns. Things got a bit loud. And for better or for worse, I think it started to ring a lot of alarm bells. We often get compared with Theranos, right? So I even ended up sometimes pitching myself as I'm Theranos for the breath, just to get it out of the way, right?
Yeah.
We have Roche as an investor via the ROX innovation vehicle. And so that adds credibility because Roche passed on Theranos back in the day, right?
Yeah.
But this is it is an issue at the same time, right? So part of it is good. People have a bit more of a mature view. Part of it is bad because a lot of people just generally say, "Okay, I don't understand it, and I'm just gonna
But then,
fix
but
it."
then I'm thinking about, I don't invest in healthcare. I only know so much about it. But I'm thinking in healthcare, you have so many cases where, like, you're actually getting really really good results out of things that you think that we developed for something else, but then they start working. Let's think about the most common of these ones, Viagra, for example. It was not meant to be used as an erection drug, quite on the contrary, but it was producing such good results that they decided to take it to market for something completely different than what the original research was for. But then if you think about it, what made the difference was they were willing to invest in this. The same can be said for the drug, what's it called, the weight loss medication now that everyone's taking it,
Yeah.
Ozempic, right? It was made for diabetes, but actually it does help losing weight. Um, so I don't know. It's like, why is Europe missing on this? Like, people should actually change their mindset and say, let's
True.
invest, let's make a couple of risks.
I mean, the weight loss at least is Novo Nordisk, so it's Danish. Um, I think
Oh,
there's a
is it?
lot.
I thought it was American. I don't know why.
No, no, I mean there are now American companies also jumping in on this.
Mhm.
Um, but I think so. There are accidental discoveries, which are great.
Mhm.
I think by and large, what I would like to see is that we work from first principles. And I'm also on the investor side. I didn't mention that, right? But so I'm on the advisory board of Speed Invest, which is a really cool big fund. They don't do hardware, but they do a lot of great things in the software space. And I have also invested a little bit myself. And so what you often get is people start with a big idea and they have a beautiful PowerPoint. And maybe even, especially in the healthcare space, they often people come if they're not native healthcare like myself. They come because they have seen something in their family or with themselves, some frustration with the healthcare system, and they want to solve that, which is really laudable. And I welcome everybody to do that. And I'm glad if they bring their skills because healthcare, I think, needs more people from the outside to come in. But they often don't dive deep enough into the science part of it and the evidence and the complexities of reimbursement, for example, and so on. So I think this whole principle of going from first principles, which means I have to have a very good reasoning before I start why this would work,
Mhm.
is super important. And you see too many people who say, we're just going to put all that data together and then machine learning, you know? Or, they have this big vision where everybody agrees that there's a problem and that there should be a solution, but the path in between is the big challenge. And that's often not thought out enough. So I love accidental discoveries, but I would also like to see more people to really start with like proper things. And by the way, the weight loss things are also used for diabetes, right? So it's
It is, yeah. That's actually
yeah,
why there's a shortage. I found that quite recently. There is this lady in the U.S. I don't remember the name of the company, but her story kind of goes like this: she had a baby. She was buying baby formula in the U.S. for her baby, and then she realized that actually the key components are mostly sugar, and so she thought to herself, surely there's something more nutritious I can give to my baby apart from sugar. So she decided to create the Better Baby Formula company, and it's now a billion dollar worth company because she just created better baby formula, like very basic things. But that's an example of what you were saying, which is people not from healthcare. She has no background whatsoever in healthcare. She just decided, okay, how
yeah,
can I make this better? That's it, right?
yeah,
No, it makes perfect sense. Or Mark Cuban, I don't know if you've seen what he's doing with his drugs companies, where instead of he's just manufacturing, so he's buying, or not buying, he's using formulas that are in the open market. He's creating the products himself, so he's manufacturing all the drugs himself, and then he sells it at cost. So if you need to buy, I'm going to say aspirin, but no one actually needs to buy
yeah.
aspirin unless you have heart conditions. But you can buy aspirin instead of buying, the premium one for $10. You buy it for $3, and that's the cost plus the shipment. So people are trying to change the way it gets done, and best of luck to them and all that. But yeah, it's an interesting time to be alive, I guess.
Absolutely. This is going to go mad, right? So I'm focused on diagnostics right now, which I think is an underinvested area and where we can really harness a lot. Most people die of preventable diseases because the disease gets detected too late,
Hmm.
or because we find out too late that the treatment isn't working properly, right?
Yeah.
But the next thing, I think, when I'm done with this, when it's
Hmm.
hopefully sold at some point, I want to go into bioengineering, like reprogramming cells and letting them do crazy stuff.
Hmm.
There's so much that I think is going to go on in the next 10 years, which I don't know, can't probably even imagine.
Especially with AI. I mean, I was about to ask you how much AI do you actually implement in your activities, because I'm assuming there's a lot of stuff you can automate. So how complex is it, and
Yeah.
how much do you actually implement in your day to day?
So you need it on a couple of fronts. You need it for signal optimization, signal to noise, right? Nothing that gets you super excited, I guess, but like the typical stuff. The thing is, as I mentioned, we have two things. We have to multiplex, so we have to look at several biomarkers at the same time, and we have a pretty what's called high resolution time series. So normally, when you take a blood sample, you take that moment, and then you analyze that.
Yeah.
For us, we really do we want to do 10 hertz acquisition rate, so 10 cuts per second, and get end-to-end breath print. If you look at the continuous glucose measurement devices, the ones that people are wearing here, so what happened here is in the beginning, a lot of the big tech companies in diagnostics, they laughed at it. They said this is completely useless because it will not be as precise as your finger prick capillary blood or the blood from the vein, and so will not fly.
Yeah.
What they didn't understand is the power of continuous data. If you have a high time series, you don't need to have the same kind of accuracy because you have a much more density coverage of the whole day. Plus, you can look at trends. So suddenly you see that the person has a good blood sugar throughout the day with the diabetes, but there's always a dip at night, and you're not measuring because they're not measuring it. Or you can suddenly learn that if there are certain patterns in how your blood sugar evolves after you ate something or something like this, you have a higher risk for diabetes and so on, right? It even motivated people to lose weight. So now you have these lifestyle apps.
Zoe, for example, is one of them. Where I don't know if it's
Yeah,
a big thing in Germany as well, but you
yeah,
put the glucose monitor, and then it tells you exactly what you should eat, what you shouldn't eat, because it measures your blood spike in different nutrient, like different food items. So if you eat pizza, it goes up. If you eat, I don't know, a steak, it goes down, or
yeah,
something like that. So it
yeah,
measures.
yeah.
Interesting.
To the machine learning question.
Machine learning question.
So, and that's where it gets interesting. So now, what is it? 5 or 6 years ago, I was looking at a tool. It turned out that it's not working, but we didn't know at that point. That claimed that by putting something in the ear, it can continuously measure the blood pressure. And my first reaction was, I need to figure out if doctors want that. So I asked, and what most of them said, dude, I don't know what to do with that. It's too much data. I'm used. My guidelines tell me measure in the morning, middle of the day, evening. The person has to be sitting. Do it all standardized, measurement on the same arm, etc. No coffee, blah blah blah, and then I know how to adjust the treatment.
Yeah.
If you suddenly change that because you're overloading with data, I cannot do an evidence-based decision. So the guidelines have to be adjusted first, and that takes forever. But if you could have AI to make sense of these things and predict certain things and saying, hey, look, it seems like because of this and this pattern, it should be explainable, frankly, but it could detect, associations of certain complications down the road with certain spikes or whatever. And then suddenly you can use that. Now with the breath, you have this layer, plus you have to multiplex different lab values, right? One is elevated and one is a bit lower. This one was lower before, and I don't even have evidence for what I'm just saying, right? But that's our thinking of what we need to do. And that's something where clearly the human mind is going to be overloaded because these things are non-linear, might be different from person to person. We go back to this baseline, absolute versus personal, and so on, where AI is just probably going to be so much superior.
But then it'd probably be easier to ask people to do these tests because they won't be invasive, right? No one's sticking anything up any cavities or anything like that. Just saying,
Yeah.
hey, can you just breathe into the tube?
Yeah.
And that's something you can easily do, and it doesn't really take much of your day. Okay, maybe you cannot eat, I don't know, mint chewing gum or smoke a cigarette for that day, but it's not the end of the world, right? It's pretty easy test to do.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think the future is bright, and it's fascinating when we got started in conversation, because I was always thinking about, you always read these news about like dogs that were sniffing someone and started licking, and it turned out to be skin cancer, right? But then the amount of data a dog normally gathers compared to ours is absolutely crazy, right? So having a machine that can measure that is really, really cool.
I mean, I love dogs and I'm amazed with what they can do. But the problem with dogs is they don't scale. They're super expensive to train. It takes a long time. You need a handler. People are afraid of dogs. People have allergies. You're not going to see a dog sitting next to each doctor smelling for like certain diseases, right? And
Yes, I
And
know.
then they're not explainable. Right? They will just bark or something like this, and you don't really know what they discovered. Right?
Yeah, it might work, in the odd tabloid newspaper, but it doesn't really work in real
Yeah.
life.
And to your very good point on serendipitous discovery. So what happens now is suddenly really, really renowned researchers come up to me and they say, "Hey, I have this idea. We could maybe use this for disease X. Honestly, I have no idea if it works. I even have doubts if it works. But if it does, the impact would be so tremendous that I just have to try it."
Yeah.
And so I'm basically now sometimes I'm just saying, okay, let's create let's we have a workflow. You tell me what you want to find out. We discover which biomarkers might make sense. Then we can tailor make a device, and you go out there and you do your research, and we see what happens. And it's kind of like a crowd knowledge kind of strategy, whatever your ecosystem strategy, whatever you want to call it. And I don't know what's going to come out of it, but I'm very, very excited that these things are happening. And I didn't ask for it, right? It just naturally suddenly occurs.
But it does make a lot of sense. I mean, we were talking about H. pylori and how you can test it from a breath test.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot more diseases you can test from a breath test. They normally take forever to test. I was just reading on, watching this silly YouTube. Remember Jackass, that show on MTV where the guys were doing stunts, right? And there was this crazy guy, Steve O, and he was saying he had this bacteria in his mouth which gave him constant bad breath, and there was nothing he can do. It was this chronic bacteria he had, right? Obviously, you can smell his bad breath, so it kind of became a thing. However, being able to actually measure what causes certain smells in someone's breath, or if there's a disease attached to it, it's super powerful, right? And that's actually, I'm pretty sure a lot of companies were willing to pay for that. And I'm myself as a patient, potential patient for everything, right? I would want to do that instead of doing super invasive tests. But yeah, I think the future is bright. I certainly hope it is. I certainly hope to go to the doctors in the future and
Yeah.
can you breathe into this tube and see what happens.
Yeah. I really hope that too. Like a lot of challenges, but
Mhm.
that's what I kind of visualize seeing it on people's desk. And that's the beauty, I think, of, I mean, I was mostly in the digital space. I created a card game on the side, just as
Mhm.
a fun project. And it sometimes gave me more joy than anything else, just because it's like a physical product and people are touching it. It lives with them in their homes and being used. And that's extremely gratifying. So I think that's also why now I'm excited to do something that has at least partially a hardware component.
So for people listening, would you mind sharing if you're raising, how much you're raising,
Yeah.
people can reach out to you? And Harry, you haven't actually asked any question today. I'm not sure if you have any questions to ask Harry. Um,
Thank you. Working hard for it. Um,
so if so people who are interested in potentially investing with you, can you tell us a bit more, like how much you're raising,
yeah,
what series you're in, and then we normally like to end the podcast with contact details. So if you want to share the contact details for people, say, hey, I want to reach
yeah.
out.
Oh, nice.
How can you do that?
I mean, uh, we are raising on a very exciting new development. That one, if it was just me, I would be happy to share it, but it involves some other parties, so I can't fully. I hope in a few weeks I can. But there's going to be a big leap forward, and we're probably going to reach first customers signed at least with a pretty large project. So a couple of really exciting things that happen that will require more capital. It's in the single digits in the millions in euros. We have quite some money soft committed already, which is also cool, and could use of 1 to 2 more million easily. Um, Preferably, well, I mean, people who are passionate, people have to understand that this is a longer game. So it's not something where I can promise like this hockey stick coming up right away and then there's the exit in 3 to 4 years. It's probably a longer journey. The positive side of that is it's also going to be very impactful if we get it right. I mean,
Yeah.
Harry, I'm only talking about medtech right now, but we also are looking into biogas, data-driven biogas. There are studies that suggest that you could have 20% more efficiency. We're talking to car manufacturers, and that's only the beginning of that. Of course, we have to be focused, but the upside can get pretty wild. And another aspect is we have really cool investors. If the fortunate part, if you're in this field, you get people that are very passionate and they don't need necessarily money. They of course want to do things that they don't want to build a church, and they look at the economics as well, but primarily they're driven by doing something that really leaves a lasting impact on the world. And so they'd be joining a nice league of really interesting people.
You should talk with that guy who's trying to live forever. He keeps on showing up on my TikTok. Ryan something.
Yeah.
Right? He's all about medical innovation.
Yeah. It just attracts interesting people. If there's one thing that I would particularly like to single out in all of this journey, it's the people that allowed me to get close to and spend a lot of time with. I didn't imagine that before I started, but it's really great. How to reach out? LinkedIn could be one. So it's Sven Jungmann, Jungmann.
Jungmann with the J, right? Because
Yeah.
you're German. So.
Yeah, very good. Thanks.
Very important to mention that. Sorry.
and Sven is SVEN. Or they can just reach me at sven@halitus.io.
Perfect. Sven, thank you so much for your time. It's been
Thank you,
super
guys.
insightful. We hope to see your device or this idea actually materialize in a doctor close to us soon, if all goes well. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the FaceTime, and also to you a lot of success. I love your podcast, what you're doing. I think the mission is
thank you.
really important.